The second most common question that I get other than plastic about the greenhouse is about my shade cloth. What is it? Does it serve a purpose? So let's dive in. So I use burlap in my greenhouse as a shade cloth. And it's simply because it was inexpensive and I really love the way that it looks. But I do need shade cloth in my greenhouse to help protect my plants from the sun. So I'm in zone 6A, 6B, I'm on the edge there, but it still gets hot enough underneath that plastic in the summer days that the temperature rises and it does affect the plants. So you might see folks use other things, such as sheets or lace or commercial shade cloth, and you might be wondering what's the difference and what should I use. The most important thing to consider is the density of the fabric, and that simply means how loosely or tightly the fabric is woven, and therefore how much sun is going to shine through. So color of fabric and type of fabric, whether it's cotton or something else, does play a little bit of a role, but in my opinion, it's not nearly as important as the density. Now you'll find that commercial shade cloth that is marketed as shade cloth lists on it a percentage. So it'll say 50% shade cloth or 30% or 80% shade cloth, and that is referring to how much of the sun it's letting through. Of course, with burlap and other things, there isn't a percentage, so we're going to talk about that. But here's a spoiler alert. 50% shade cloth is going to do just fine for a good majority of plants. It can be a general rule of thumb. So the real trick to knowing about which shade cloth to buy is what kind of plants are you going to grow and how much sun do you want them to get? Are you growing tomatoes that need a lot of sun, or are you growing orchids that need shade? Are you growing houseplants? Are you growing a mixture? You're going to want to choose your shade cloth depending on what you're going to grow. So you might be wondering if you need shade cloth if you already have some shade over your greenhouse. And the answer is, it depends. And you're probably going to want to experiment. So my greenhouse is under a large oak tree and a large maple tree. So it gets part sun, part shade. I'm also in zone B, not in an extremely hot climate, but I still do want shade cloth. It gets so hot in the summer when the temperature rises, baking underneath that plastic, that shade cloth really does help. So let's get back to fabric density, which is again how loosely or tightly the fabric is woven. Now with commercial shade cloth, it's either knit or woven. Knit shade cloth is made from polyethylene, and it is more loosely woven and can be cut to a different size without it unraveling. It's also more lightweight and easier to work with. Woven shade cloth is made from polypropylene, and its threads are more tightly woven together and it's a little bit heavier. If you try to cut it to size, it will unravel, so you have to buy the size that you need. It does give a little bit more UV protection, but I don't know that that will be a consideration for a home greenhouse. So I do use burlap, and a friend of mine who gave me the inspiration for my greenhouse, she uses lace in hers. And both of these are actually really good shade options. Burlap is comparable to 50% shade cloth in terms of the amount of light that it lets through. With lace, I'm going to guess it's going to be around 30 to 50%. It's going to depend on the type of lace, since some laces have really large holes and some laces have smaller. Okay, so next, let's talk about some useful information. What plants need what type of shade? So heat-loving fruits and vegetables like tomatoes and strawberries and peppers, a shade cloth that is around 30% shade, meaning that it's going to let about 70% of the sunlight that hits the greenhouse through it. But many flowering vegetables and plants do just fine around 40, 50, 60% shade. Vegetables that like partial sun, like spinach, lettuce, and cilantro, really do just fine with 50 to 60% shade. And then your shade-loving plants like orchids and philodendrons and ferns, they like anywhere from 60 to 90% shade. And just know that if you're spending a lot of time out there, or your animals are spending a lot of time out there, we like 80 to 90% shade in order to feel comfortable. So with the burlap that I used, it was very inexpensive to buy, and I have 3 pieces of it, and they simply drape up and over my overhead beam, and then I use inexpensive clips to clip it to the sides of the cattle panel greenhouse. This last winter, I decided to leave the burlap up. I usually take it down over winter, but I love the look of it so much, and it makes it feel a little bit cozier over winter, and I'm not really trying to grow anything anyway, so I left it up. Otherwise, I previously would roll it up on the sides and then take it back down in the summer. So we talked about density, and now let's talk about color of shade cloth, because it does vary great. So white shade cloth is going to reflect sunlight and heat. It keeps a greenhouse cooler, but it only diffuses the light. So it lets in the full light spectrum, including UV rays. Now, if you're using greenhouse plastic that also protects from UV rays, then that's not a big issue. You might want to use light shade cloth if you live in a hot climate and you are worried about excessive heat and sunlight getting to your plants. Black or darker shade cloth absorbs heat and light. It makes a greenhouse hotter, but it also filters the light and protects from UV rays. Now again, if you have greenhouse plastic, you probably don't need that extra protection. You might want to use dark shade cloth if you live in a cooler climate and you're trying to keep as much heat in your greenhouse as possible. Or you might also want to use dark shade cloth for out in the garden when you're trying to shade your plants from the hot sun. Now, are all of these differences significant? It depends. It depends on your climate, your goals, your aesthetic preferences. For me, black shade cloth would not help me much in the winter in terms of keeping heat in, because I don't get very much sun back there anyway. It's on the north side of my house. Someone else in my same zone that has a greenhouse out in full sun and is really trying to grow during the winter may want to experiment with a darker shade cloth. Now, this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention one other option, and that is to put shade cloth over top of the greenhouse on the outside rather than inside underneath the ceiling. The benefit is that the cloth absorbs or reflects the heat and light before it even enters the greenhouse. If all of this information is making you feel a little bit heady, just remember that 50% shade cloth or somewhere around there is going to be good for a whole variety of plants and flowers. If your greenhouse is dedicated to growing something specialized, then you might want to put a little bit more research into it. And don't forget about the little tweaks that you can do inside the greenhouse no matter what shade you have. Move light-sensitive plants behind another pot or underneath a table. You could place shade cloth on the outsides and leave the top unshaded. You could put shade cloth on the sides and leave the top uncovered, depending on what direction the sun is coming from. And the more time you spend out there, the more in tune you'll be with where the sun is hitting and which plants need shade. So observe, and your plants will tell you what they need.